Well, good evening, everybody. Just want to give you a very warm welcome on behalf of King's Church to this special debating event this evening. That's better, you can hear me now. It's so good that you took the time to come, wherever you've come from, and especially good to welcome our panel, who are all here tonight and waiting to address us. So, my name is Dan Hutchison. I'm one of the ministers of King's Church, and you may ask the question, well, why, as King's Church, are we hosting this debate tonight? Very simply, two reasons. It's a debate of profound interest. It's obviously going through Parliament, but here's reason number one. This isn't a specialist interest. This is something that affects all of us in terms of how you die, when you die, choices around death. This isn't just something for a specialist few, but this is something that affects everybody ultimately, either directly or indirectly in the care and helping of other people. Here's the second reason why it's important for us as a church is this, that as Christians we're actively engaged in caring and preparing people, counseling them, both spiritually and emotionally for death and what lies ahead. So therefore this debate comes right in the midst of what Christians are most passionate and excited about, which is actually helping people prepare well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our chair this evening, who's going to introduce the panel to you. Our chair's name is Will, and he's an experienced debating coach, and he will ensure that we keep things on track this evening, and we'll be introducing the other guys to you just now. So over to Will.
Thank you very much to Dan Hutchison and to the King's Church for hosting us tonight. As you mentioned, on the 14th of November 2013, Margaret MacDonald introduced a bill proposing that there come into effect an act of the Scottish Parliament to make it lawful in certain circumstances to assist another to commit suicide. Now, sadly, she informed us on Tuesday that her health would not permit her to attend this evening, but thankfully Liam McArthur, MSP for Orkney and co-signatory of the bill, has stepped in. And he will speak alongside Patrick Harvie, MSP, who is co-convener of the Scottish Green Party and co-sponsor of the Assisted Suicide Bill. Speaking on the other side of the debate tonight, we have Dr. Eva Hutchinson on my far right, who is a consultant of palliative medicine, and Mr. Richard Lucas, who's representing the Solus Centre for Public Christianity. The format of the debate is as follows. Each speaker is going to launch an opening speech of 10 minutes. We're going to start off with Patrick, then we're going to have Stephen, then Liam, and then Richard. Following the opening speeches, each of those speakers will then, in the same order, have the opportunity to ask a question to the other party, and it is likely that a discussion will ensue from each of those questions. Following those four key questions, introductory questions, then the debate will be opened up to questions from the floor, which we aim to finish at 9 o'clock, and we'll speak more about that later. So without any further ado, I'd now like to welcome Patrick Harvey to open the debate.
Thanks very much. Can I first of all thank you for the invitation to come and take part. Hopefully we'll have an interesting debate. I wanted to begin, though, just with a wee experiment, because it seems to me that there's probably something approaching 129 people in the room. It's a similar number to the Scottish Parliament. In fact, we might be slightly over 129, I'm not quite sure, but it's of that order. Let's just imagine, run through the exercise, that you are the Scottish Parliament. Everybody in this room is a member and has a vote, and today is decision time on the general principles of a bill on assisted suicide. Not a debate on the detail. Amendments come later. The Scottish Parliament first votes on the general principles. Could I get a sense from the room? Could you stick up your hand if you've already got a pretty clear idea in your mind about how you're going to vote on the general principles when we all press our buttons at decision time? Okay, I'm not sure that's quite everybody. Let's see the people who are genuinely undecided on the general principle. I think that's maybe single figures, maybe a dozen, thereabouts. I think one of the things that tells me is that we in this room are not typical. I think a great many people in Scotland at the moment, and in many other societies, are open to this debate. Many people have not yet decided. how they feel about the general principle, and would be open to the debate on how the detailed arrangements might work if legislation was to pass, but are open to the general principle. And I think over the years we've seen opinion polling way back to the 1970s showing that majority of support in the public for some variant on assisted suicide. At the moment, the most recent surveys seem to suggest over the last 5 years or so 82% support. That seems to be the order of at least people being willing to contemplate, to entertain the principle. So this room is a wee bit different. And I did that exercise as well just to try and explore whether this is going to be similar to the previous debate that I had that Solas organised, where I had to recognise on the debate around same-sex marriage, right at the beginning of that debate, that we were probably coming from fundamentally different worldviews, not just different opinions about policy, but different worldviews. And that's going to be the case when the Scottish Parliament debates this legislation as well. People with a fundamentally different understanding of what life is. Once upon a time, it was pretty clear that most people and society at large regarded life not as something that we individually own, but something that was a gift from a deity. And I'm sure there are many people in this room who continue to hold to that belief. But we now live in a society that doesn't impose that idea on anyone. Religion is for those who subscribe to it and is protected under equality legislation, but it's not imposed on anyone. We're not only a less religious society now, in which fewer people would hold to that idea that life is given to them by a deity, we're also in a society in which there's a recognition of the range of views amongst believers themselves. I've got some quotes here from Scott McKenna, for example, who's a minister, who said that we're told that we shouldn't interfere with God's plan by shortening human life. This portrays God as brutal and less loving than we are to our pets. When the church speaks of compassion, it means to stand in someone else's shoes. Yet too often the church seems distant, cold, and paternalistic. So there's a range of views being expressed by religious hierarchies. A move away from the view that religious hierarchies represent all believers, and a move towards a more secular society and a less religious society in general. And so I do think we need a debate that recognises and respects the right of those to live their lives according to their religious beliefs and to treat their own lives as a gift from God, but doesn't impose that view on others. There are probably some for whom this position is implacable, to which they are not open to argument or persuasion. But that in itself can't be allowed to hold back the rest of society from debating this issue. There are other objections, of course, beyond the purely religious objections that we frequently hear. One is around the idea of pressure on vulnerable people. Now, this in many ways comes down to free choice. We absolutely mustn't allow the prospect that anyone might seek to undermine the right of someone to make this choice on their own, to put pressure on someone to opt for an assisted suicide if that wasn't really their wish. We must absolutely guard against that. But I would argue that it's equally unacceptable to impose the opposite choice, to remove somebody's ability to make a decision on their own terms, dealing with their own life and applying their own values to it. To impose the option of an assisted suicide would be appalling. To deny it is also to impose a choice that someone has not freely made. Another objection is raised that it may not be compatible or seen as not compatible with advancement in palliative care and with an advancement in people's rights to access palliative care. I would argue exactly the opposite. Both should be seen in the context of opening choices for people, allowing services to meet people on their own terms and in accordance with their own values, opening up choices, not closing them down. And I would be very happy if other members of the Scottish Parliament wanted to lodge amendments to this bill which sought to expand the statutory duties on public bodies to provide palliative care, or to expand the legal rights that people have to access it. Another issue which is raised is often around the relationship between health professionals and patients, and a desire not to change the nature of that relationship. A view that if assisted suicide is even an option, it in some way undermines the medical role of a doctor or of other health professionals. I think in looking at the detail of the bill that's actually being proposed, I would encourage you to think about the changes that have gone through in the proposals over the various years and how they meet these various objections. Back in session 2 of the Scottish Parliament, Jeremy Purvis, a colleague of Liam's, attempted to lodge a member's bill, had some debate on the issues, floated the arguments and allowed the issues to be debated, but in the end wasn't successful in moving forward with the member's bill. In session 3, Margaret MacDonald came with her first proposal, which did include more of a role for health professionals. And the new bill is very different. The new bill, let me take you through the stages of the process. If the Scottish Parliament was to pass this bill, not only does someone have to be over 16 and registered as a patient in Scotland before they can even begin to activate the choice of an assisted suicide. First of all, stage 1 is that the person must sign what's called a preliminary declaration. That can be made by somebody who's in good health, indicating in advance to their own GP or to another health professional that this is their general attitude to assisted suicide. At least 7 days later, they can make a first request for assistance. That must be endorsed by 2 medical professionals. At least another 2 weeks must pass before they make a second request for assistance, again endorsed by 2 medical professionals. And at both those request stages, those medical professionals must certify that the person is capable of making the decision, of communicating and understanding the decision, and of retaining the memory of the decision. And only after all of those stages are passed, with the medical professionals being satisfied that the person is suffering from a terminal or life-shortening illness. Only if that is passed, with the registered, licensed and trained facilitators who are not allowed to be family members, not allowed to be anyone with a financial interest in the death of the person requesting assistance. Those facilitators would have a role in procuring the drug that would be used to end the person's life, delivering it to them, and removing it from them again if they don't use it within a specified time period. So there are multiple opportunities to ensure that this is a considered, thoughtful decision. There are safeguards around the role of medical professionals who would have no role at all in the provision or the actual administering of the drug in question, and clear safeguards against impropriety by family members or others with a financial interest. So in closing on these opening remarks, I would encourage you not only to think about how you instinctively feel about the principle, because none of us can really know until we face it exactly how we would feel about it, but also about the efforts that have been made to address the detail, make sure that the safeguards which are so often requested by opponents of this legislation in principle, the safeguards have been put there in practice to develop a system that will be right for Scotland and that will recognise everybody's ability to make a crucial moral decision on their own terms, not on the basis of values that are imposed upon them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Mr. Patrick Harvey, and I'd now like to welcome Dr. Eva Hutchinson to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. On numerous occasions over the past few years, assisted suicide has been rigorously debated in public and in the parliamentary spheres, and convincingly defeated. But here we are again with a broadly similar proposal, despite what Patrick has said, a broadly similar proposal, and inevitably a reiteration, as we'll have tonight, of the same old debate. Margaret MacDonald's 2010 bill was promoted as safe and robust, but actually wasn't, and has now supposedly been refined. But she says her opponents have not refined their arguments. Well, I concede that point. We believed then in the sanctity of life, and that it is wrong to deliberately end life. Our position is clear and principled. Hers keeps changing. Which is more trustworthy on such a momentous issue? So we have before us a bill which is frightening in its scope and lack of detail. Assisted suicide for terminally ill people, but also those with, quote, progressive conditions which could be terminal or life-shortening for that person. What on earth does that mean? Diabetes? Dementia? Infection? These would all fit. How is the suicide actually achieved? Patrick's mentioned a drug, but the bill is completely silent on how the suicide is achieved. Although the policy memorandum has some rather woolly comments about this and about the actions of the facilitator if the patient is too weak, it really will not do to present something of such momentous importance in such vague and indeterminate terms. Why do carelessness or mistakes not matter, apparently, as long as someone is acting in good faith? And it's frightening to see assisted suicide associated with reduced healthcare costs. What on earth are we trying to legalize here? And can someone please explain to me the logic of assisting suicide with this bill, whilst the Scottish Government is pursuing a well-established and successful strategy to prevent suicide? The founding principle of this bill is autonomy. Now, the dictionary defines autonomy as making decisions and acting on them regardless of others. Essentially, I can do what I want. Really? Ladies and gentlemen, there are no decisions that we can make or actions we can take which don't have an impact on others. Maybe trivial, sometimes important, but an impact nonetheless. We have freedom to choose and act, but not regardless of others, and certainly not without responsibility to others. Human beings are relational, not autonomous. That's how society works. We are mutually dependent. Yes, I am my brother's keeper. It is not all about me. And if assisted suicide, anyway, depends on the adjudication and assistance by others, then clearly I wouldn't have autonomy in that either. So the declared foundation of this bill is nonsense. You know, when you're ill, it's scary. You become vulnerable, you become dependent on others, and you can be very easily influenced. Many of you will know that that is true, and it's something I have to be very careful about in my work. Did you know that over 500,000 elderly people are abused in the UK, particularly those who are dependent and frail and alone, and that the perpetrators are actually friends or relatives most commonly? So when you're facing an incurable or a chronic illness, or the prospect of suffering, or the costs of care are starting to eat into your family's inheritance, just think how little influence would be needed to make you think that you should have your life ended if assisted dying was available, particularly if you're elderly and frail and vulnerable and feel that you're a burden. Jane Nicklinson, the wife of Tony Nicklinson, said this: there would have to be very strict procedures to protect vulnerable people, but at the moment they're being protected at the expense of people like Tony who can't take their own lives. Exactly. You and me and the people we love protected by the law. That's good law. So what assisted dying proponents do, of course, is to introduce safeguards. Well, you wouldn't need safeguards if it was safe in the first place, would you? But let's look at this. The main safeguard in the present bill, as we've heard already, is the requirement to pre-register. In other words, you can only have assisted suicide if you've previously declared your willingness to consider it. So if you don't want it, really nothing to worry about because you won't have made a preliminary declaration. Now, if someone can be coerced into assisted suicide, and remember that's why this safeguard exists, then why could they not be coerced into making a declaration? The declaration may be made, we've heard already, when the patient is well, the person is well, or during illness, or even almost immediately before invoking the assisted suicide process. And I really think you'd have to come up the firth on a biscuit not to foresee the eventual abolition of that safeguard, because it will be inequitable for the really sick people who have not made preliminary declarations, or because it can be made so soon before the assisted suicide process that it becomes irrelevant. It's a gossamer safeguard. Lord Faulkner, of all people, the chairman of the Commission on Assisted Dying and a strong protagonist, said that no safeguards are watertight. Lord Walton, who was on the Select Committee on Medical Ethics at the time this sort of thing went through the House of Lords, said it would be next to impossible to ensure that the law was not abused. We're not talking here about some trivial legislation about the shape of bananas or something, but we're talking about precious human life. It's the duty of government to protect its citizens, and the law as it stands may well be inconvenient and problematic for a few, but it keeps the vast majority of us safe. That's the law. What about ethics? This bill attempts but fails to distance doctors from the process, but the majority of doctors remain opposed to this. Doctors work within an ethical framework, and historically, we will not deliberately end life. But once again, Margot is trying to impose this obscenity on my profession. And to develop this bill without engaging moral and ethical issues is profoundly irresponsible. Law also must have an ethical basis. And legislating for the deliberate ending of human life is not simply a matter of getting the practicalities right. We've heard already tonight that assisted dying commands strong public opinion, and so it would appear. Surely that is compelling. Well, parliamentary guidance advises cautious interpretation of public opinion, which tends to be reactionary rather than considered. It can't be taken at face value, they say, and it is not a reliable basis for making the law. But Margot continually cites public opinion and thereby ignoring that guidance. And when we look at considered opinion, ironically in response to her own consultations, 87% first time round and 64% this time round were actually opposed to assisted dying. A little while ago, I was co-signatory to a letter from several senior clinicians published in a national newspaper criticising the inclusion of euthanasia in Margot's last bill. And she responded in the same paper by saying that she did not favour euthanasia and that we were confused about the terminology. However, during committee proceedings, and I was there, she admitted, and I quote, assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia would be possible under the bill, and that these were essentially the same, and that limiting such legislation to assisted suicide, again I quote, would be illogical. So in the current proposals, Margot clearly embraces that illogicality and advocates assisted suicide, but not euthanasia. It really doesn't inspire my confidence when the sponsor of this bill has had no consistency or clarity about these issues. But just in case you are in any doubt whatsoever as to her current intentions, read the policy memorandum, which makes it crystal clear that she's playing things down now in order to get it through Parliament in the hope that the law can be relaxed later on. I will quote you her paragraph later if need be. A rather vivid example, I suggest, of slippery slope or incremental extension, and something that proponents of assisted dying say there's no such thing. Well, when in Holland half the original criteria for assisted dying are now ignored, that is slippery slope. And when there's increasing complacency with regard to breaches in guidelines, that is slippery slope. And when in Oregon, numbers of assisted deaths are increasing and where the original requirement for psychiatric assessment to identify depression is now essentially ignored, that is slippery slope. And when babies with congenital abnormalities are killed and when only a handful of these cases are reported, that is slippery slope. And when someone is euthanized because of anorexia nervosa and another because of depression, and when twins are euthanized because they feared becoming blind, that is slippery slope. And when Belgium now euthanizes children, and when nurses illegally euthanize patients but don't get prosecuted, and when elderly, frail, hospitalized patients are killed without their request or even discussion, that is slippery slope. And when in Oregon, your treatment may not be funded, but your assisted suicide will be, that is slippery slope. And when our sensitivity to these atrocities becomes anesthetized, that is slippery slope. But what about intolerable suffering and the supposed need for assisted dying? Well, do you know that it's actually the fear of pain that makes people want this? Not pain itself. But in this country, in the UK, we have the best palliative care in the world. That's official. We must have compassion on people who suffer. I do. That's my calling. That's my profession. We must ensure that palliative care gets even better and more accessible, and continue to strive to improve care and alleviate suffering, but not by legalizing assisted suicide. That's unsafe and unnecessary, and we can do a lot better. Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Stephen Hutchison, and I'd now like to welcome Liam McArthur to continue.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, although don't take it the wrong way and suggest I really rather wish I wasn't, in that I am replacing Margot MacDonald. Her absence from the Parliament is keenly felt. I rather suspect her absence from this debate will be keenly felt, and that is no undue false modesty on my part. As Patrick's already explained, what we are witnessing now with Margot's bill on assisted suicide is a third iteration, if you like, of the proposals. My colleague Jeremy Purvis sought to introduce a bill in the second session of Parliament, and it was a debate on the proposals underpinning that bill that I sat through shortly after getting elected in 2007. It was the first debate I think I sat through where I wasn't anticipating contributing, but such was the importance of the issues under discussion, such was my desire, I think, to better inform myself about the relative cases that both sides were putting, and indeed those who I think in the Chamber hadn't yet made up their mind on those proposals, that I was moved to be in the Chamber that evening. And I found it a fascinating and very moving experience. I think the cases put on both sides of the argument by MSPs across the Chamber from all parties were exceptional, almost without exception. I think the case that was being made on that occasion by those opposed to what Jeremy was proposing about the advances in palliative care and the benefits that palliative care brings in, and indeed the need for further investment in palliative care and enhancing the rights to that care. All of those were arguments that it was difficult to find anything to disagree with, and nor did I. I think what I did come away from that experience, though, feeling slightly uncomfortable about was the suggestion by, I think, an MSP, that will remain nameless, but an MSP that evening sought to suggest that the Scottish Parliament had no business debating that issue, and I found that deeply troubling. I very much welcomed Dan's introductory comments about the importance of this issue, and indeed the importance of a Christian faith in engaging in it for the reasons that he set out. I would see it as an important debate in which those of all faiths and of no faith engage in, such is the profound importance of it. And I think Patrick's exercise in gauging those who come at it genuinely undecided, I think was interesting. It, I suppose, presents those of us who have arrived at a view and have an opportunity to vote on this bill with a challenge. There is no doubt about it. But I think the iterative nature of what we've gone through in Parliament has been a helpful and a healthy experience. Stephen sought to suggest that by adapting and amending the proposition, somehow this was a sign of weakness, a lack of principle, as it were, in the motivations of those taking forward that bill, whether it be Margot or those of us who've supported that bill. But politics is about what is possible, what the public is prepared to accept. When those who present legitimate challenges to what it is that you're proposing, you have a choice to ignore those. And I have to say, we've seen examples of governments over the period of all persuasions, and both here and in Westminster, adopting that approach and getting themselves and everybody else into a great deal of hot water in the process. I think that the process that we are seeing with this bill has, as Patrick indicated, seen an improvement in the proposals that Parliament is being asked to scrutinise. And I am in no doubt whatsoever that through the scrutiny of the Health Committee and then of the wider Parliament, I would hope and expect those provisions to be refined still further. Indeed, that maybe fairly significant changes would be made to that bill. But I think that is right. I think I can think of very few examples of where issues of this complexity, of sensitivity, where emotions on both sides of the arguments run high, where an element of compromise is not absolutely essential and indeed healthy. I don't think it necessarily tells us a great deal to trade statistics on what public opinion says on this issue. I'm very sceptical. I probably shouldn't say this as we career towards a referendum in September, but I am slightly sceptical of the ability of such polling to gauge accurately public opinion on an issue that is quite so complex and multifaceted as this one. And it will depend on the question that you ask, the response that you get back. But I suspect that the changing public mood on this is a reflection of where we find ourselves today in terms of the advances in medicine and the advances in palliative care, that more people do have personal experience, whether in their family or their wider group of friends. They will have personal experience of the sorts of cases that give rise to the concern about the restrictions that we currently have in place in relation to this area. My father-in-law was diagnosed with cancer about 15 years ago. He passed away 2 years ago. And thanks to the sorts of advances that Stephen was referring to, he was able to lead a very normal, independent, high-quality life until the very end. He, I think, spent, in the end, 4 or 5 days in bed with his family around him, supported by Macmillan nurses, and I think was the epitome of what palliative care can offer. But in some senses, he was fortunate. I know of others, fortunate not in my family, but I know of others who've not been so fortunate. And this isn't a debate around coercion, to me. This is a debate around choice and individuals' rights to that choice. As Patrick indicated, there are a number of safeguards that have been brought forward in response to quite legitimate concerns that were raised in relation to Margot's earlier bill and indeed to the debate that surrounded Jeremy Purvis's bill. I think in terms of protection of those who are vulnerable, those who suffer from depression, the staged approach that Patrick has outlined, I do think goes a great deal of the way to address those concerns. That's not to say there may be other safeguards that are felt necessary, but nevertheless, I think it comes a long way to meeting the concerns that were raised previously. The suggestion that somehow abuse of whatever provisions are in place is inevitable, again, I can understand the rationale behind that. It's certainly something that any of us who are in the position, particularly those of us who are in a position of changing the law in such a fundamental way, are cognizant of. But I don't think there's anybody here that can claim that there aren't currently abuses taking place because of the restrictions that are in place that simply go beneath the radar screen and are somehow not noted. And a reflection, I think, of how the law as it currently stands doesn't reflect the needs and the rights the public and individuals actually expect. And religious objections, again, I entirely respect those, though I have to say from my own personal experience in an Orkney context, and this is reflective of nothing other than my caseload in Orkney, may not be indicative necessarily of what happens elsewhere. But certainly in terms of the representations I've received, there are those of different faiths who take very different positions on this. And I think Patrick maybe alluded to that again in his earlier remarks. So while I respect religious objections to what is proposed, I don't think necessarily those reflect as accurately as they are often portrayed the perspectives of those of faith. I maybe conclude by saying I was at the launch of Margot's bill in the McDonald's Hotel a few months ago, and I was greatly impressed and moved by the contributions made by a number of speakers that morning, save for Margot, who seemed to refer to the fact that I was from Orkney and therefore of a Neolithic upbringing, and therefore question whether I'd be able to articulate the reasons why I was supporting her bill, which didn't seem to be the best way of building a broader coalition, I have to say. But one of the most impressive speakers that day amongst an array of impressive speakers was Reverend McKenna. And he suggested that the right to life should not be conflated with a duty to live. And I think for me, that begins to suggest to me that there's a way through the difficulties that quite understandably and reasonably people in this room and out with will have about the bill. The difficulties that Patrick and I as legislators will have to try and wrestle with and come to agreement where we can, to the extent that we can. But nevertheless, I am in absolutely no doubt that MSP who suggested that evening that this was a debate the Scottish Parliament should not have was the only person in that chamber that evening who was absolutely wrong. And I look forward to the debate this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
I'd like to thank Mr. Liam McArthur and now welcome Mr. Richard Lucas to continue.
Tonight. I extend my welcome to the debate as well. This is a home fixture for me. This is the Christian community that I'm a part of. Worship here on a Sunday, so it's great to be here for a debate for the first time. Now, when this assisted suicide was debated in the Scottish Parliament the last time, Patrick Harvie gave a speech, and I'd like to quote some of the words that he started his speech with. He said, "I could stand here and give a speech about my belief system, but in a democratic institution, Parliament should not privilege any one particular belief. Religious belief or subscription to a doctrine can be the basis of a person's moral life, but our society and the secular authority, Parliament, must not become a means for imposing such a religious position on everyone. Our authority comes from the electorate. So I can only start this argument with the principle that life belongs to the person living it." Now, to my ears, that doesn't sound like an attempt to win the argument. It sounds like an attempt to sideline opposing views because they're religious. Now, of course, everyone approaches moral issues from a personal, ethical perspective. And if this isn't a moral issue, I don't know what is. And Patrick, in that quote there, he finished stating his own fundamental principle he brings to bear on this issue. He says, a life belongs to the person living it. Now, I'm not even sure that's a coherent statement. Does a sentence of the form X belong to X even mean anything? I'm not at all sure that it does. But even if it did, what are the implications of that? That's not at all clear either. My car belongs to me. Does that mean I can do what I like with it? My left kidney belongs to me. Does that mean I should be free to sell it on the open market? No. So then Patrick's central principle is doubly flawed. It's potentially incoherent, and its implications are unclear. So it's hardly a solid foundation on which to base a case for allowing assisted suicide. But I believe that Patrick's got every right to offer that view from his personal perspective in public and political debate. Now, my view is different. I believe that every person is of equal value, created in God's image. That's a view that finds its roots in Christian theology, but it accords with the intuitions of most people outside university philosophy departments and humanist societies. Human life has intrinsic value, and we act against our intuitive sense of morality and the good of wider society by assisting suicide. If I thought assisted suicide was immoral, but had no negative effects beyond the person killing themselves, I would not oppose its legalization. But God's given us a conscience and moral guidance to protect us individually and collectively from harm. Morality is not a matter of arbitrary taste, as Patrick seemed to be implying, but a crucial framework for a healthy society. Our authority comes from the electorate, Patrick said. Well, I'm part of the electorate, and I've got a vision of a positive society in Scotland informed by my Christian faith. And Patrick's suggestion that my views should be set aside and his own made central to government decision-making is nothing more than special pleading. Debate on this issue should not be stifled by playing the secularism card. Now, the intrinsic value of human life, as I said, is an intuition that's widely held in our society, but it's increasingly held without an intellectual foundation as secularism has progressed. For millennia, Western medicine's been dominated by the Hippocratic tradition from the time of Christ up until about the 1960s. And the reason is because it cohered with the Christian ethos of that society. And this banned the killing of patients, as it was seen either through abortion, euthanasia, or assisted suicides. Now, other societies now, and other societies through history, have had different codes of ethics, where unwanted babies would be left out to die, suicide was seen as an honourable option, etc., etc. And the view that's taking hold now in our culture is that the value of life is dependent on capabilities, intellectual capabilities. It's dependent on quality of life. It's dependent on age. Some people argue things like, if you're 98 and someone murders you, well, that's not as much a crime as murdering someone younger, because you didn't deprive them of as many years of life. This is the sort of reasoning that's taking hold in our society. Now, Peter Singer, Australian Humanist of the Year, 2004, he's at the forefront of this view of the value of life. He says a newborn baby is of less value than a cat because it has less capabilities to live independently. And if you disagree with him, he'd call you a speciesist, someone with a sentimental and irrational bias towards your own species. So on this worldview, it becomes an open question about how valuable your life is, or if it's valuable at all. It also becomes an open question of how valuable someone else's life is, and that's a question that's increasingly been asked in our society. Belief in the fundamental value of every human life protects the vulnerable from mistreatment and motivates ongoing care and support for those who need it most. Now, I don't agree with Hitler on many things, but there's one statement he made that was absolutely right. He said, in nature, the law of the struggle for survival reigns. Everything incapable of life, everything weak is eliminated. Only mankind, and above all the church, have made it their aim to keep alive the weak, those unfit to live, and people of an inferior kind. And it was spot on. I'm part of mankind, I'm part of the church, and I do indeed oppose the killing of the weak, of those who some think are unfit to live, and those of an allegedly inferior kind. Now, Stephen's already referred to the bill being proposed and how it already admits that it's the first step to further extensions. But once the principle's been conceded that assisting people to kill themselves is a valid function of the state, where does that logically lead to? Why restrict it to the terminally ill? What about someone who's got unbearable pain but's not terminally ill? Surely they've got the right to die. What about the person who's not in unbearable pain, but they've such a loss of independence, their quality of life is so poor that they want to die? Why should they be excluded? What about the person who hasn't got physical conditions, but suffering from mental conditions, mental anguish? Why should they be excluded from the right to die? What about the person who's so disabled that they can't self-administer the poison or whatever the means of suicide is? Surely we can't discriminate and exclude the disabled from this measure. What about people who are not capable of making decisions for themselves, if they're not competent? The universal principle in our society is that if a person's not competent to make decisions for themselves, then that decision-making power is handed over to someone on their behalf. Surely the same principle would extend to this. Once we have the idea that some people would be better off dead, if someone else is acting in your interests and they believe you would be better off dead, why should they restrain their instincts of mercy to help you in that regard? People will begin to say eventually, at the end of the day, why should anyone have to jump off a bridge? Surely if someone wants to commit suicide, they don't have to do these inhumane, these dangerous, these distressing methods. The state should help them. The logical endpoint is suicide on the demand on the NHS, by following the same logic to its conclusion. The logic is a person owns their own life, and therefore they can end it when they want to. If you look at experience in other countries where this has been introduced, in Holland, increasing numbers of assisted suicide and euthanasia, and also increasing numbers of non-voluntary and involuntary euthanasia. In Belgium, a woman who wasn't happy with the results of a sex change, so euthanasia. It's also been now applies to children as well. In Switzerland, the Dignitas so-called clinic, the founder of that says he wants to help more mentally ill people in the future. In Holland, some elderly people carry cards with them, a bit like a donor card, but it says, "I don't want to die." Because these people are frightened of being taken into hospital. They're frightened that they might be killed. They're frightened that a doctor might make the decision to not treat them, so they carry a card just in case. If someone faces terrible personal situation, for example, they become paralyzed, in a culture where assisted suicide is talked about as accepted, then that's going to be uppermost in the person's mind. And at the stage where that person really needs to be grappling with the terrible problems of how are they going to adapt and make the most of the rest of their life, if the infection of the idea of suicide's there, I think that can reduce their willingness to make a go of the rest of their lives. Already, people who commit suicide are described as brave. And the inevitable corollary of that is that some people who decide to carry on living must therefore be cowards. Where assisted suicide is accepted, it will result in us becoming less willing to care for example, the babies who are very ill and the elderly when they become burdensome to people. Lady Mary Warnock, a very influential medical ethics expert, wrote this: "If you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your family lives, you're wasting the resources of the National Health Service." And she wrote an article called "The Duty to Die." And she's not the only one arguing along these lines, because it makes sense. It follows logically from the same principles. Now, if caring for your family is wasting your life, what's fruitful and meaningful? Going on holiday and reading a good book? Is that what we should see as really making the most of our lives? Wasting NHS resources. Do we really want a culture where we say to some people, caring for you is a waste of our resources? That's just saying you're worthless. Do you want to be looked after by doctors with those views? When the idea of a duty to die becomes more and more widespread, how will that influence resource allocation decisions in the National Health Service? The inevitable consequence is the most vulnerable in our society feeling insecure, guilty, and unwanted. Now, the Scottish Government does have a programme of suicide prevention, and quite rightly. And it's well documented that there is a psychological effect known as the Whirter Effect. Whereas when people hear about instances of suicide, the incidence of suicide in the general population increases. Introducing assisted suicide would be an experiment on a national scale of the Whirter Effect. I'd just like to ask Patrick and Liam a very simple question. If they were addressing a group of teenagers, and a teenager put their hand up and said, "Is killing yourself an acceptable option when you're facing terrible problems?" How would you answer? Yes, no, or depends? My answer is no. I'd be fascinated to hear what your answer would be. I assume it depends. The last thing I'd like to mention, with this issue, is quite often people will say, doctors already withdraw or withhold futile treatment, patients can already decline treatment, life support machines are turned off, Patients sometimes lose consciousness until their death through pain relief, etc. Surely that amounts to killing. Surely assisted suicide and euthanasia are really no different. But in the crucial moral distinction is performing an act that's intended, its fundamental intention is to hasten death. That's the definition of killing. So then there's a very clear distinction between dying as the result of illness and health issues or being killed by yourself or by a doctor. And I believe that's the only principal place to draw a line in these issues. And without the line drawn there, we are on the slippery slope that I've described and that Dr. Hutchison's described. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Richard Lucas and to all the speakers. What now follows is one question from each of the speakers to the other side, from which debate may emerge on the table. So I'd now like to invite Patrick Harvey to ask a question of Stephen and Richard.
Okay. I think I'll direct a question to Dr. Hutchison, if that's okay. I think you talked... Sorry?
It depends.
Okay, well, let's give it a whirl and see what happens anyway. I think you talked about two broad principles in your remarks, one on the sanctity of life, and I can entirely respect that position. I have many friends for whom a humanist mindset has led them to, for example, an absolute pacifism. If one believes in the sanctity of life, that's clearly a conclusion. So there's some overlap between worldviews there. But the other one was on autonomy, and you used a dictionary definition, which I think quite often slightly kills a debate, sticking to dictionary definitions. People use the word autonomy to mean their own agency in making decisions. It doesn't mean, surely, making decisions in the absence of any reference to other people, regardless of the relationship which you rightly stress that people have with others. Would you accept that very many of the people who either seek or in fact exercise the choice of assisted suicide do so in a deep, thoughtful relationship with the family and friends and loved ones around them? That this is not a decision that most people would ever take in a selfish way, but rather they would tend to make it in a context of loving support, if and wherever that is available.
Well, I think it's difficult to say how most people are actually responding to that. I don't have any doubt that the situations in which people find themselves when they contemplate assisted dying of one form or another are very extreme situations normally, very distressing situations. But I think the thing is that we can't actually confidently say or state what sort of influences they are under, either external influences, either what is sort of expected of them out there in a sort of assisted dying friendly society, as happens elsewhere, or what family pressures are being brought to bear. I've already mentioned that in terms of the elder abuse problem, and this is a very, very fertile ground for elder abuse. I think you'd have to agree with that. Or is it internal pressures of what I feel I should be doing for the welfare or my inheritance from my family, or whatever else it might be? I think there's endless numbers of influences which might be directing the person one way or the other, and I think it's impossible to say. It's impossible to clearly tease out what is the predominant influence, and that's one of the things that concerned me in the last bill, and it concerns me again in this bill, because we talk about ensuring that the person is not acting under undue influence. Now, there are some words in our language which are very bland and throwaway and can make anything right. One of them is appropriate, and the other is undue influence. What is undue influence? At what level does influence in that person become undue? At what point does influence in that person, at what point is it acceptable? At what point is it malicious? At what point is it self-seeking part of the family? The answer is, I don't know the answer to your question, and I don't think anybody could answer it.
Well, can I reply? I mean, I think that there are uncertainties in all that. There are always uncertainties in life, and all of us in the relationships that we have with friends and family influence and are influenced on a whole host of things. But we don't criminalize people for example, deciding that they will refuse a form of treatment. We don't criminalize people because they might be making that decision under malicious influence. We would need to be very clear, very sure. If we're going to criminalize people, charge people, take people to court and potentially imprison people, we need to be very, very sure that kind of malicious influence was at work. And we certainly wouldn't withdraw people's right to make a choice on something like refusing treatment. And so I think the same principle applies. Life does contain uncertainty, but it also contains an instinctive human desire to take choices about our own lives into our own hands.
We certainly have moved on beyond the stage where we criminalise somebody who has taken their own life, and rightly so. But we're not talking about that. We're talking here about somebody else taking action to end somebody else's life in one form or another. That is criminalised, and I think our own Parliament last time and in other parliamentary debates made it very clear that it is an entirely different thing to think that you can impose the requirement on somebody else to assist your death. That's a completely different kettle of fish to taking your own life, and that's what I'm saying. That should be criminalised. I don't believe in criminalising the suicidee, if that's a correct word.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Dr. Hutchison to ask a question to the other side.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question which relates to what I think Patrick was saying about the imposition of views. Now, I would probably concede that as Christians, sometimes we can be a bit of an annoying bunch of people. And we can be a bit rigid, we can appear to impose, and sometimes maybe we do impose views on others, and I do not believe that is right. Jesus Christ, who we follow, because he's someone who has changed our lives, he never imposed himself on other people. And on several documented occasions in Scripture, he absented himself from a situation because people did not want him there. So I don't think we've got any precedent as Christians for imposing our views on other people. So I'm absolutely with you on that. But I wonder, actually, in this debate, who really is doing the imposing? On numerous occasions, 5 or 6 times over recent years, this has been debated endlessly in public, and people who propose assisted suicide, let's just have the debate. I pull my hair out. We've had the debate endlessly. It's been rejected several times, and here it comes again. Who is doing the imposing here? I think there's a fundamental illogicality in what you were saying, because in a democratic society, ultimately, the law will come down on one side or another. And to just dismiss that as saying, well, that's an improper imposition on the disadvantaged group because of that, it seems to me, as I say, a fundamental illogicality.
Well, no, I do disagree. I think in a democracy there is no ultimate decision. There is, a constant ability for democracies to revisit and change their positions. Parliaments are re-elected every 4 or 5 years. New MSPs, new MPs, new members of the House of Lords, for as long as that's still there, will continue to have the right to debate these issues in the light of changing values in society. And I'm sorry that at some level the continuation of this debate is not welcomed. It's slightly odd because Richard Lucas in his speech accused our side of stifling the debate, which seems rather odd given that we're the ones who are seeking to keep it open. I think the question about imposition is, to me, very, very clear. If we impose this choice, either choice, to live on through a terminal illness, through what an individual regards as intolerable suffering, if we impose that choice, it seems to me that is as wrong as imposing the choice of somebody ending their life before they feel ready or before nature takes its course. And I do come back to this question of autonomy, the ability to have agency in our own lives. If we seek to permit but not compel, then we do need to change the law. And I would encourage people, anyone who's still open-minded, actually to take a look at what's in the bill, and don't get swept along with objections to things that are not in the bill. We've had objections today about the killing of babies, about people being regarded as inferior to one another, something about cats that I didn't quite get. None of this is in the bill. Please take a look at what's in the bill and decide whether you have concerns about that, not about a whole host of straw man arguments.
Thank you very much. You'd like to respond?
Well, simply just that, the sort of things that Patrick is dismissing there are really come down to the sort of moral and ethical and philosophical points. It is not, as I said earlier, simply a case of just getting the practicalities right. And I took considerable exception to what I read in Margot's consultation document, saying that in the past there was wide-ranging and very specific consultation on the last bill. Many of the moral and philosophical points that emerged are unchanged. I do not intend to consult further on these general issues, but would rather look at the practicalities. How irresponsible is that to dismiss the sort of ethics of something from a bill as momentous as this? And I think what Patrick is criticising is what my colleague Richard was mentioning in terms of, the bit about the cats and so on. We're talking here about the principles, an ethical principle espoused by humanists in that particular example, but these principles are actually important, even if there isn't anything about cats in Margot's bill.
If I could just provide some basic information, the parliamentary procedure for a member's bill, if a particular question raised in a member's bill has already been consulted, you don't consult again. But the committee process will include a public call for evidence. It will include public, on-the-record scrutiny and evidence-taking from a range of organisations, perhaps including yourself if you want to approach the committee. So these issues, including the deep ethical issues, although they were previously consulted on, they will still be part of the scrutiny and the debate on the bill. So that's not being closed down at all.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to welcome Mr. Liam McArthur to ask a question.
Thank you, Chair. I think it was Stephen referred to the fact that the law is there to protect individuals, and it occurred to me that only seems to be half right. The law is there to protect individuals and their rights. And therefore, I think what both Patrick and I have tried to articulate is the rights that are being denied of an individual to take their life in very specific circumstances and under with very particular safeguards in place. And therefore, is the law not there to uphold those rights?
If you're asking the question to me, I think it brings me back to something I said earlier, that inevitably law will restrict some people's rights. I'm not entitled to drive back to Inverness tonight on the right-hand side of the road, even though I may wish to. The law denies me, well, maybe I don't, but the law denies me that right. So in terms of principle, the law does not always, it's completely impossible that the law should protect everybody's rights. I've said already, we live in society. It's not all about the individual. It's a societal welfare that's at stake here, not the individual.
Look, as you say, I think there isn't a matter of principle about autonomy that can settle this issue one way or another. Every law restricts our autonomy. Laws tell us that we're not allowed to do things. There's other things that we are allowed to do. There's not a simple matter of principle that says you're allowed to do whatever you want to do. There's not a matter of principle that says you should be banned from doing anything that's going to cause any harm to yourself or anyone else. Every case needs to be assessed on its merits. And generally the fault line between secular liberal ethics and the Christian view is the Christian view tends to focus more on the effect on wider society, in society in general, whereas the secular liberal view tends to focus more on autonomy and, as we've been hearing, rights language. People should be able to do what they like, and if it has bad consequences for other people, well, that's downplayed more. I think that's the fault line in ethical questions in general, and it's the fault line that's been exposed here.
I'd now like to ask Richard Lucas to ask a question.
I'd like to take Patrick up on his comment. He said, when assessing this bill, he said, don't think about various scare stories and what might happen. He said, think about what's actually in the bill, the wording of the bill. So I'd like to read you what the bill says. It says, assisted suicide will not be available to all those that the member would ideally wish it to include. Once it's been seen to operate effectively for a number of years, there may be an opportunity for further developments in the law that would offer hope to categories of people seeking assistance to die. So that's the text. So it's already conceding that there'll be extensions to that in the future, or that it's raising the prospect of that. I'd like to invite Liam and Patrick to describe where they would draw the line in what we've both described as a slippery slope. Who would they exclude from assisted suicide? Which category of people would they exclude from it, and on what principled grounds?
Could I just double check, first of all, what the quote is that you're taking that from?
It's paragraph
it's
54
not in the bill.
of the policy memorandum.
It's the policy
It's
memorandum.
the policy memorandum.
Whereabouts, sorry?
Paragraph 54, I think.
Paragraph 54, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, this paragraph 54 of the policy memorandum, just for anyone who's not familiar with the process, when any bill is lodged in the Scottish Parliament, whether it's a member or a government bill, two documents are required. One is explanatory notes, one is a policy memorandum. Sometimes, most often, a third is required, which is a financial statement about the impact on the Scottish Government's budget. Paragraph 54 of the policy memorandum is under a section headed Alternative Approaches. Now, this is required in a policy memorandum. A member is required to set out what are the other approaches that you could have taken to the issue that your bill addresses, and why have you not taken them. So the member putting forward this bill is required to set out what are the other approaches that could have been taken, and why has, in this case, Margot decided not to take them. So the fact that Margot is discussing this in the policy memorandum is a perfectly normal procedural requirement. It's not something that's saying covertly, we're hoping to take this further, but we don't want to tell you. If that was the case, it wouldn't have been written down in the policy memorandum. This is simply a discussion around the alternative approaches, and it is a requirement of the Scottish Parliament's processes that Margot lodges this aspect of the policy memorandum. My own view is that I support the bill as it stands. The bill as it stands requires people to be over 16, it requires people to be registered as a patient in Scotland, it requires people not for making the initial declaration. Anyone can make an initial declaration. I could do that not being someone who's ill in any way at the moment, other than a touch of high blood pressure. I can let my GP know that if I was ever in that circumstances, I want them to know that I, in principle, support assisted suicide. But the second, third stages and the triggering of the facilitator actually getting hold of the drug and supplying it, not administering it, but giving assistance in it being administered, those are things that require somebody having had two steps at each stage, two medical practitioners to say that they are suffering either from a terminal illness or a life-shortening condition. I support those provisions, and if anybody wants to come up with a variant on that, I'll listen to their arguments.
I mean, as somebody who will have a separate vote in that, I mean, I would subscribe very much to what Patrick has said. I'd sat through the process with Jeremy's proposals and subsequently with Margot's bill, and was well aware of the concerns that were being expressed there, and I certainly had misgivings. I mean, I was prepared to put my name to both bills in order to allow the process to continue to the next stage. But I think Patrick's right in highlighting the response that was made to those earlier concerns. But it is perfectly open to other members to come forward either with further restrictions that they would wish to see or extensions that they would wish to see. Whether or not they would carry any favour more broadly amongst MSPs would remain to be seen. But I think given the consultative process that's gone through on this bill, the bar that would need to be cleared in terms of any wider extension is a pretty high one.
So the question I asked was whether there was a matter of principle that would draw the line somewhere in the slippery slope. And I think that question singularly has not been answered. There. Well, we already know that you support the current bill. Well, I was asking where further on the slippery slope, where can a principled line be drawn? I think that question hasn't been answered. Is there any category of people who should be excluded from assisted suicide? I think saying you haven't really thought about it yet, I don't think that's an adequate answer. That's not reassuring. No, is there a matter of principle?
I've certainly thought long and hard about this bill and about the principle underlying it. It's a neat piece of verbal tricksterism to ask where I would draw the line on a slippery slope. It's rather like, when did you stop beating your wife, that question, isn't it? Because if you accept the argument of a slippery slope, then it doesn't matter if there's a line drawn on it, it's still slippery. I don't accept the argument of a slippery slope. I accept the argument of parliamentary democracy, that parliaments should make a decision about what the law should be. There is no other way, legitimately, to make law in our society. And if in 20 years' time a future parliament, of which I'm highly unlikely still to be a member, unless I'm very lucky and not bored yet, if a future parliament wanted to change this legislation, or sweep it away and go back to something much more restrictive, that is for that parliament to decide on the basis of its mandate.
Sorry, could I just clarify the nature of a slippery slope argument? A slippery slope argument is a logically valid argument, and I presented a logical slippery slope by saying a principle that's been stated has logical implications that will follow. And the way a logical slippery slope argument must be refuted is you must bring in a matter of principle that will indicate where you can draw a line on the slippery slope. There's nothing wrong with slippery slope arguments. It's a valid argument form, and to refute it, you need to say, no, I can draw a line at this point with this matter of principle, therefore this one doesn't follow from this one for this reason. And I think that's what we haven't heard.
I can understand why you would like that to be possible. It's not possible. Legislation doesn't work that way. Society doesn't work that way. No parliament can pass legislation that binds a future one.
Thank you very much to all the panellists for their opening speeches and their questions, and we will hear again from all of them in a 2-minute closing speech in about 15 minutes' time. It's now come time for the floor to have its say. Now, we're going to have a microphone that's going to emerge by this pole over here. So if you'd like to make a speech, please, because this is being filmed, so we would like you to go to a single location. If you'd like to ask a question to any of the panellists, we'd invite you to do so. I'd like to remind everyone, please, that this should take the form of a question to the panel. We would like it to be brief, and it should not include any offensive language or personal attacks to the members of the panel.
Your argument about the slippery slope, had that been accepted, we would not have women having the vote. It came to Parliament repeatedly and had to change constantly. The next point I want to make, I am a Christian priest, and I have been so, and I intend remaining so till the end of my life, for the last 50-odd years. I think we should be prepared to pass this bill.
Thank you very much to the Speaker. Could I please insist that the contributions from the floor do include a question? It is part of the format of the debate, but thank you. If Mr. Lucas would like to make any comments, he's welcome to.
The idea of introducing votes for women being a slippery slope, I think the principle behind introducing votes for women is universal suffrage, that all adults should have an equal right to vote. Now, I don't know what that's a step on the slippery slope towards. So I really don't appreciate that point at all. Now, of course, there are some Christians in favour of assisted suicide. Scott McKenna has been mentioned a couple of times. I've actually debated with him on this topic. Scott McKenna I would describe as something of a maverick. His personal beliefs I wouldn't describe as Christian, to be perfectly honest. But yes, there are people of different opinions. But is that a relevant point to debate? I'm not trying to speak here as a representative of Christendom at all. I'm giving my personal opinion in the debate along with everyone else.
I wanted to first thank the speakers, but with one reservation. Some of the speakers were quite rude, particularly about Margot, and I think in her absence that was pretty bad behaviour to insult somebody like that. I'm a doctor. I'm also a patient. I have severe renal failure. As a patient, I have a living will. I hope that when my time comes, there will be the option of assisted suicide. As a doctor, I was disappointed to hear the dismissive, "Oh, most doctors disagree with this" comment. I thought you might all in this room like to know that a group of us have formed a new group called Doctors for Assisted Suicide, specifically to support Margot's bill going through the Scottish Parliament. No, I don't have a question. I just want a final comment. The comment I want to make.
The purpose of this debate is to allow the panelists to debate. I really am going to have to ask you to hand over the microphone, please. We've got some questions to make. Could I please ask you to take the microphone?
It would allow me to offer better care as a doctor.
If you'd like to respond, you're welcome.
Just very briefly, of course there are some doctors who favour assisted suicide. Nobody's disputing that. But what I said is a fact that most doctors are opposed. Most colleges, most doctors' organisations are opposed. And if you want a reference for that, there's a journal called Palliative Medicine, published an article in 2009 by Professor Clive Seal documenting that fact.
Hello, Niall O'Quinlan, incoming chair of the Alliance of Pro-Life Students. I just wanted to ask the proposition of the bill. I can't remember which of you it was that used the comment that because something currently that is illegal is done, you stated, kind of implied that currently there's the potential that people may be assisted to die or euthanized under the current system. That was an argument in favour of the legalisation of assisted suicide. Surely by that logic, everything that is currently illegal, that is done illegally, should be legalised. But my question more specifically comes on to, as you speak about this becoming the right to die, the right to choose to die, this is a debate about assisted suicide. Keyword, assisted. It is not about someone's right to die or a right to kill themselves. It is about their right to demand that someone else help them to do so. Is that not the case?
I would say no, it's not about a right to demand. It's about a right to ask. Clearly, at the moment, people have the right to ask. Asking is not a criminal offence. Giving that assistance would be a criminal offence. It's about the right to give that assistance to someone who asks, who makes repeated requests, and who satisfies the other tests in the legislation. So it's not about a right to demand. It's not even about the right to ask, because asking is not criminal. It's about the right to agree to offer assistance to someone who has asked.
I think the point you were driving at in relation to it happens already was a reference that I made. It was not to suggest, I think as you're implying there, that things that are illegal that are currently done should simply be made legal to make the situation more transparent. It's, I think, a reflection of the fact that evidence suggests that this does happen, but it happens in circumstances that do not have the safeguards in place, where I think there is probably some case to be made for vulnerable people feeling under pressure, and therefore I think some of the provisions in this bill actually enhance that situation and offer protection that isn't currently there.
One of the most famous instances of that, I think, was Lord Dawson, who killed King George with administering morphia and cocaine entirely without consent. Something that I hope that all of us would condemn entirely. He did it on the basis that he wanted to ensure the King's death met the early edition of the Times rather than a lesser newspaper later in the day, and he later voted against the legalisation of euthanasia on the basis that this was a matter for the medical profession's wisdom. Let's at least acknowledge on both sides that we've moved on a long way, and that can be a positive thing.
Could you just say something about the idea of pressure. I think there is obviously the possibility of direct pressure relative to encouraging an elderly relative to have assisted suicide. Save on the care home costs, have a new extension instead, etc. There is that side. But there's another side that can't be regulated and can't be controlled. And that's the implied pressure and the feeling of guilt that will be internalized as a result of living in a society where assisted suicide is regarded as a valid option and where your continued living is regarded as a choice that you've made that you can be held accountable for. There's no regulation that can avoid that implied, subtle, underlying pressure that's created by a society that accepts assisted suicide.
Very briefly, if anybody really wants some evidence as to how rarely doctors are doing this in the United Kingdom, I've got them here. I'd be welcome to share them.
Liam, Patrick, thank you for your presentation. Given that the bill requires the involvement of a medical practitioner, presumably a GP, at 3 separate points, and to prescribe the unspecified medicine, do you see it as a problem that last month, after one of its biggest consultations ever, the Royal College of General Practitioners found 77% of respondents were opposed to assisted suicide? How would you encourage GPs to comply with legislation, and would you insist on having a legally binding conscience clause for those who refuse to participate in it?
On the last point, yes, absolutely. Medical professionals would not be under any requirement to have any role in assisted suicide, whatever, if it was against their conscience. I think just on the question about the general opinion of GPs, let's remember that GPs were against the creation of the NHS. They don't always get it right.
Could you say something about the conscience clause thing? If you look at the example of abortion, there's a very sensible conscience clause included there that's currently coming under pressure. And if a conscience clause like that was included, you can just imagine the news programme, people from the National Secular Society, the Humanist Societies, will be popping up saying this is unjust, that these religious people are given these special privileges, they're paid to do the job, now they should just get on and do it. If they didn't want to be a doctor, then they shouldn't have become a doctor, they should have done something else. That's exactly what we're hearing about abortion, it's exactly the line we hear in other areas, and it will be exactly the line we'd hear in this case. So assurances at this stage about a conscience clause, I'm afraid, are meaningless, because it would be eroded in the future.
Well, I mean, I think we get back to this notion that I think Patrick responded to before in a slippery slope. We cannot do anything at present to bind a future Parliament. And I have to say, if the scenario that you've mapped out were to come forward, there are precious few of those of us who are supportive of the current bill who would be marshalled to support those sorts of provisions. So actually the bar you're trying to get across is going to be even higher than it was before. So I think that all you can deal with is the legislation in front of you. And we've seen it in other pieces of legislation. We've seen it in terms of the Equal Marriage Act. Those self-same provisions were sought in that regard, were entirely reasonable. If you want a piece of legislation that is permissive and doesn't compel, then that seems to me a logical way to go.
Can I say
terribly sorry, we are beginning to run very short of time. What I think we're going to do with the remaining 4 people with a question, please, is if we can have all 4 of your questions one after the other, and if we can try and make them brief, that'd be much appreciated. And then the speakers can choose to build in any of the comments they wish to make into their concluding statements.
Okay. One observation first. As a lawyer, I would say that the phrase undue influence is a very clear phrase. It's used quite a lot of the time in this sort of legislation. I think that's probably the right phrase for the promoters of the bill to be using. One question comes to my mind, which is that the European Union are presently seeking to prevent the export to the USA of drugs used in executions. I think that's probably something most of us can support, but would that not give the promoters of the bill a practical difficulty were the same principles to be extended to the purpose of the bill? Secondly, it is at least possible that this time next year, Scotland will be seeking to write a constitution. Does that not give the opponents an opportunity to set out clear red lines in a constitution which defines what's on and what's not on, so as to prevent the point being brought back to the Parliament without, first of all, going to a referendum to amend the constitution?
Whether you're a Christian like myself, or a politician, or a humanist, assisted suicide is murder.
That's the statement. Sorry. next, please. Questions, please. Remaining
Right. So the idea of autonomy is a difficult concept to grasp. In law, you have to pin it down. But what about uneasily defined things as bipolar stress disorder, where to make up your mind is a very vague thing and you switch back and forth?
Again, I want to extend my thanks to everybody that's spoken tonight. My question is regarding safeguarding. We've said that, I don't know whether it's 2 or 3 medical practitioners would be required, and that this is seen as a safeguard. My experience of the current abortion laws, I know this is not a debate about abortion, but there are similarities. My personal experience as a doctor within the field of obstetrics and gynecology is that the current abortion laws mean that you need 2 doctors to sign a form for an abortion to go ahead, and I presume that this was to do with the safeguarding of that original act, to make sure that abortion was only carried out in particular circumstances, in particular instances, and that would require 2 people. There is a question. That is now, abortion is available on demand because, as a doctor, I have to, under my conscience, conscientious objection, I have to hand it over to another doctor who is willing to make that. I would assume that a similar thing would exist in an assisted suicide act. Therefore, as a doctor, I cannot refuse somebody's request. I cannot refuse somebody's request for abortion because I have to hand it on to somebody else. So I don't have to do it myself, but that's not a safeguard because there'll always be somebody who will say that that is okay. Therefore, my question is, how is that a safeguard when I can't say no?
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. I'd like to thank all the contributors I'm afraid we've run out of time, but there may be an opportunity to discuss with some of the speakers afterwards. We really are pushed for time in terms of things like people getting trains back, so each of the remaining speakers will now make a short, under 2-minute concluding speech, please, in reverse order from the opening speeches. So I'd now like to welcome Richard Lucas to make his concluding remarks.
Thank you. I think the 2 fundamental points that have gone unanswered tonight by the other side of this debate is the issue of pressure, psychological, society pressure, and all sorts of subtle ways that can't be regulated that will make people feel a duty to die, feel guilty for the decision to carry on living. Any talk about safeguards to restrain those ill effects are ineffective. It's to do with the culture, it's to do with psychological influences in society. When it came to the slippery slope, I think the opposing side were utterly unable to state a principled position of drawing a line on the slippery slope that we described towards suicide on demand and including euthanasia as well. As I said, the fault line between the Christian moral vision and secular morality is very often between secular morality being rights, autonomy, I've got the right to choose to do things exactly the way I want to, and the Christian moral vision of how do we create the best society. What guidelines will create the healthiest society, the safest, for the benefit of everyone? And I think that's the choice that's before us tonight. For me, this question is not about, I want to be able to do things my way and do what I want. It's to do with what sort of society will be best for everyone and what sort of society do I want to ultimately live in and my family live in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd now like to welcome Liam McArthur to continue.
Thank you very much, Chair. I was always told that the first person to mention the Nazis had lost the argument. So when I heard Hitler being quoted, I did have some misgivings. Nevertheless, I think we've heard arguments that are familiar to me, and some of which I have an element of sympathy with, and I would see having to be wrestled with very seriously, first by the Health Committee and ultimately by MSPs across the Parliament. But as to a moral issue, I think we've already heard evidence again this evening that this will cut across those of faith, as it will cut across those not of faith. I don't see this as a divide between secularism and Christianity, because I see plenty of examples where that is not the case. I think we have a bill here that has responded to many of the legitimate concerns that were raised with its predecessor. It is permissive and doesn't compel. I think the point that was made about autonomy and the and those who are bipolar, again, a legitimate concern. I don't have sufficient medical background to be able to indicate one way or t'other how the safeguards would work in those situations. But again, that would be precisely what the purpose of the bill's scrutiny would have to deal with. But I think that there is a requirement on Parliament to continue to wrestle with this issue, because it's an issue that my constituents, and I think constituents of every MSP in the Parliament, wish to see us continue to engage with. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be constantly considering pieces of legislation, but nor can we bind incoming parliaments not to consider the issue. I can think of issues on which I'm required to have an opinion, sit through debates and even make contributions that seem to me a good deal less of a good use of my time and everybody else's time. And therefore I welcome the debate we've had this evening. I can see this stretching on. If nothing else, it provides a distraction from the referendum. And I'm very grateful, albeit, as I say, I would rather that Margot were here defending the bill that she's done so much to bring forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd
Assisted suicide always generates very strong and passionate feelings, and often more heat than light. I'm encouraged this evening that we've been able to have an intelligent and a thoughtful discussion. Patrick and Liam, tonight you're our opponents, not our enemies, and I appreciate your contributions. We've had some very clear and practical reasons for hearing why this bill is unsafe, and I've criticised its moral and ethical paucity. We must be honest enough, and I'm glad to hear Patrick acknowledging that, we must be honest enough to say that morals, ethics and faith actually apply to us all. Patrick couched that in terms of understanding what life is, or different world views. And that applies to us all on both sides. We must challenge the intolerance of those who discount a faith-based view. Supreme Court Justice Lord Sumption said this last year, "Basic questions of right or wrong cannot simply be ignored when deciding whether assisted suicide should be allowed. It is a fundamental moral construct." And societal responsibilities brings into focus what actually happens. I'm not trying to scaremonger when I talked about slippery slope. This is what happens in assisted suicide-friendly societies. What happens where it's practiced? The abuse, illegal activity, underreporting, action which without question would be murder here. And Lord Carlisle, a member of the House of Lords Select Committee on Assisted Dying, said this: "Laws are not like precision-guided missiles. You can't just fire and forget. Once they're out there on the statute books, they have a habit of causing collateral damage well beyond the intended target area." I am not assured by Patrick and Liam's impression that law could be tightened up later on. That tends not to happen. What's the safest law for the greatest number of people? There can be absolutely no doubt what the answer to that question is. The deliberate ending of human life by others should remain illegal. The law as it stands is clear and safe.
Well, like others, can I thank you again for the invitation and for your questions and participation. And like Stephen, I'm very pleased that we've had the opportunity to have this debate on friendly terms. I suspect that even if this legislation was to pass, far fewer people would be taking up the option of assisted suicide than die in countless other ways sanctioned by the state, through the export of arms, through the aggressive projection of military power around the world. And I would encourage those who do hold to a sanctity of life that comes from a religious perspective that I don't share, to recall that this is a relatively small number of people we're talking about compared with the things which genuinely cause vast amounts of death around the world, which should be challenged and avoided. Can I begin this summing up just by saying it's always good to say I don't know at least once in a debate as a politician, and the issue of the ban on exports of drugs intended for the death penalty in the US, I don't know what the consequence of that is. I'm grateful to the person who flagged it up, and I'm certainly going to look into that. I would hope, and I certainly support the idea of banning exports of those drugs for the purposes of capital punishment, but I would hope that there's some willingness on the part of the manufacturers and the EU authorities to ensure that discrimination can be made between the purposes for which such drugs are intended. The Constitution, I'm surprised Liam used the R word twice. I haven't used it once tonight. But if Scotland was to vote yes, the opportunity to debate these issues, the role of religion, the Church of Scotland has some clear views about the role of religion in a written constitution. I have some clear views about the role of secularism in a written constitution. But yes, it would provide an opportunity for that. Finally, safeguards. I do find it a wee bit frustrating that those who raise objections to this bill in principle seek safeguards, and then when they're included, they're used as evidence that there's something fundamentally flawed with the principle. Safeguards for doctors not to participate are not intended as safeguards for you as doctors. They're intended as safeguards to prevent people going through an assisted suicide when it is not their genuine choice. It's a safeguard for them. It's not a veto for a doctor to say you may not. And I think that's an important distinction to make. I don't know how I would ever feel if I was in the position of having to make this choice. I suspect I might want to hang on to any shred of life for as long as I possibly could, but I don't really know. If you've been swayed at all by the arguments in the debate in favour of Margot's bill, I would encourage you to pick up one of these postcards. They're available at the back, at the stall in the corner there, and fill them in and register your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of the speakers, to the contributors from the audience, and to the listeners in the audience. I would now like to briefly hand over to Stephen Allison from Solus to offer a couple of concluding remarks.
Thank you. And firstly, my name is Stephen Allison, and I am the coordinator of the Edinburgh Solus group, who have partnered with King's Church in putting this event on this evening. I would like to first thank King's Church actually for hosting us this evening. They're also providing all the refreshments that we can have afterwards, which is great, and provided great stewards, helping to get everyone to seats, etc., which meant I didn't have to worry about any of that, so it's been great. They have a small stall outside in the foyer, telling about some of the events that they do here and different things they're involved in, so please do talk to them. But the main thing tonight is to thank all of our speakers for taking part. I'm always very surprised when we get people volunteering and happy to accept our invitations to come and take part in an event like this, which is obviously quite a big thing for anyone to take part in. And I'm particularly grateful that MSPs are prepared to come and take part in these events. Both Patrick, who's now taken part twice in one of our events, and both times has made a great contribution to that event, and Liam for stepping in this evening. And I do think it's great that MSPs and politicians engaged in public life are prepared to do this kind of thing when not all of them are. So I would like to extend our thanks to them. So yeah, I'd like to again thank Dr. Stephen Hutchison and Richard Lucas for doing the work and preparing to take part, and Will Clayton for agreeing to chair our debate and keeping people in order who need kept in order sometimes. Not an easy job, but we are grateful that someone is prepared to do it. As a lot of people have obviously still got maybe questions they want to discuss, people are still around to talk about it. I would draw your attention, we do have 2 stalls at the back from 2 organisations, one Care Not Killing, who are opposing the bill, and there are people from Care Not Killing here who are happy to answer questions and discuss things, and from My Life, My Death, My Choice, which is the organisation that Patrick said has the postcards, who are supporting the bill, and there are people again there who are available to chat to you if you have questions and want to talk to them. Finally, just a little about what SOLAS is doing. We are keen to put on different events engaging in all sorts of issues affecting life, and as kind of hinted at by Patrick, the big issue at the moment is Scottish independence, and our next debate is actually going to be on Scottish independence from a Christian perspective, and we're going to bring together Murdo Fraser MSP along with Richard Lucas to argue against independence, debating against John Mason MSP and David Robertson, who is the director of SOLAS, in favour of independence. So we're bringing together people on both sides of SOLAS to have a debate on independence. We do have other things on the table. We've got some papers that we've recently published on euthanasia and assisted suicide and is Christianity credible in a suffering world, and a book we've recently published called Why I'm Not an Atheist, which is 11 people from a whole variety of backgrounds answering that question. If you would like to find out more about what SOLAS is doing, we have a mailing list on the table and we will email you about events we're holding. But again, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming along tonight, contributing and taking part. Thank you.
For further discussion of this topic, download Dr. Peter Saunders' paper on euthanasia and assisted suicide from the SOLAS CPC website.